We're reading from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3, Chapter 26, Fundamental Principles of Material Nature. We're taking up at text number 6. Because of his forgetfulness, the transcendental living entity accepts the influence of material nature as his field of activities, and thus actuated, he wrongly applies the activities to himself. Purport. Because of his forgetfulness, the transcendental living entity accepts the influence of material energy as his field of activities, and thus actuated, he wrongly applies the activities to himself. You want to look up actuated?
Yeah.
Okay.
Got it right here.
Go ahead. Use the mic though. Please. It's not so easy to attain.
So, actuate, first definition is a cause, to operate. So cause, a machine, it's in parentheses, a machine or device, out of parentheses, to operate. Cause to operate, actuate. And then the second definition is cause to act in a particular way, motivate. Derivatives, actuation, actuator, origin, late 16th century, from the medieval Latin actuate, actuit, carried out, cause to operate, from the verb actuare, from Latin actus. The original sense was, quote, carry out and practice, later stir into activity, enliven. Sense 1 dates from the mid-17th century.
Stir into activity. That's a nice verb, stir. Because of his...
By the material energy.
Yeah. Because of his forgetfulness, the transcendental living entity accepts the influence of material energy as his field of activities, and thus actuated, he wrongly applies the activities to himself. The forgetful living entity can be compared to a man who is under the influence of disease and has become mad, or to a man haunted by ghosts, who acts without control and yet thinks himself to be in control. Under the influence of material nature, the conditioned soul becomes absorbed in material consciousness. In this consciousness, whatever is done under the influence of the material energy is accepted by the conditioned soul as self-actuated. Actually, the soul in his pure state of existence should be in Krishna consciousness. When a person is not acting in Krishna consciousness, he is understood to be acting in material consciousness. Consciousness cannot be killed, for the symptom of the living entity is consciousness. The material consciousness simply has to be purified. One becomes liberated by accepting Krishna, or the Supreme Lord, as the master of the master, and by changing the mode of consciousness from material consciousness to Krishna consciousness. Accept Krishna as the master and change your mode of consciousness from material to Krishna. Material consciousness, text number 7, is the cause of one's conditional life, in which conditions are enforced upon the living entity by the material energy. Although the spirit soul does not do anything and is transcendental to such activities, he is thus affected by conditional life. The Mayavadi philosopher, who does not differentiate between the Supreme Spirit and the individual spirit, says that the conditional existence of the living entity is his lila, or pastime, but the word pastime implies employment in the activities of the Lord. The Mayavadis misuse the word and say that even if the living entity has become a stool-eating hog, he is also enjoying his pastimes. This is a most dangerous interpretation. Actually, the Supreme Lord is the leader and maintainer of all living entities. His pastimes are transcendental to any material activity. Such pastimes of the Lord cannot be dragged to the level of the conditional activities of the living entities. In conditional life, the living entity actually remains as if a captive in the hands of material energy. Whatever the material energy dictates, the conditioned soul does. He has no responsibility. He is simply the witness of the action but he is forced to act in that way due to his offense in his eternal relationship with Krishna. Lord Krishna therefore says in Bhagavad Gita that in Maya, his material energy is so forceful that it is insurmountable. But if a living entity simply understands that his constitutional position is to serve Krishna, and he tries to act on this principle, then however conditioned he may be, the influence of Maya immediately vanishes. This is clearly stated in Bhagavad Gita, 7th chapter. Krishna takes charge of anyone who surrenders to him in helplessness, and thus the influence of Maya, or conditional life, is removed. The spirit soul is actually Satchidananda, eternal, full of bliss, and full of knowledge. Under the clutches of Maya, however, he suffers from continued birth, death, disease, and old age. One has to be serious to cure this condition of material existence and transfer himself to Krishna consciousness, for thus his long suffering may be mitigated without difficulty. In summary, the suffering of the conditioned soul is due to his attachment to material nature. This attachment should thus be transferred from matter to Krishna. The cause of the conditioned soul's material body and senses, and the senses presiding deities, the demigods, is the material nature. This is understood by learned men. The feelings of happiness and distress of the soul, who is transcendental by nature, are caused by the spirit soul himself. In Bhagavad Gita it is said that when the Lord descends to this material world, he comes as a person by his own energy, Atma Maya. He is not forced by any superior energy. He comes by his own will, and this can be called his pastime or lila. But here it is clearly stated that the conditioned soul is forced to take a certain type of body and senses under the three modes of material nature. That body is not received according to his own choice. In other words, a conditioned soul has no free choice. He has to accept a certain type of body according to his karma. But when there are bodily reactions as felt in happiness and distress, it is to be understood that the cause is the spirit soul himself. If he so desires, the spirit soul can change this conditional life of dualities by choosing to serve Krishna. The living entity is the cause of his own suffering, but he can also be the cause of his eternal happiness. When he wants to engage in Krishna consciousness, a suitable body is offered to him by the internal potency, the spiritual energy of the Lord, and when he wants to satisfy his senses, a material body is offered. Thus it is his free choice to accept a spiritual body or a material body. But once the body is accepted, he has to enjoy or suffer the consequences. The Mayavadi philosophers' presentation is that the living entity enjoys his pastimes by accepting the body of a hog. This theory is not acceptable, however, because the word pastime implies voluntary acceptance for enjoyment. Therefore, this interpretation is most misleading. When there is enforced acceptance for suffering, it is not a pastime. The Lord's pastimes and the conditioned living entity's acceptance of karmic reaction are not on the same level. Text 9. Devahuti said, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, kindly explain the characteristics of the Supreme Person and his energies, for both of these are the causes of this manifest and unmanifest creation. Prakriti, or material nature, is connected with both the Supreme Lord and the living entities, just as a woman is connected with her husband as a wife and with her children as a mother. In Bhagavad Gita, the Lord says that he impregnates Mother Nature with children, living entities, and therefore all species of living entities become manifest. The relationship of all living entities with material nature has been explained. Now, an understanding of the relationship between material nature and the Supreme Lord is sought by Devahuti. The product of that relationship is stated to be the manifest and unmanifest material world. The unmanifest material world is the subtle Mahatattva, and from that Mahatattva the material manifestation has emerged. In the Vedic literatures, it is said that by the glance of the Supreme Lord, the total material energy is impregnated, and then everything is born of material nature. It is also confirmed in the 9th chapter of Bhagavad Gita that under his glance, adhyakshena, under his direction and by his will, nature is working. It is not that nature works blindly. After understanding the position of the conditioned souls in relation to material nature, Devahuti wanted to know how nature works under the direction of the Lord and what the relationship is between material nature and the Lord. In other words, she wanted to learn the characteristics of the Supreme Lord in relation to the material nature. The relationship of the living entities with matter and that of the Supreme Lord with matter are certainly not on the same level, although the Mayavadis may interpret it in that way. When it is said that the living entities are bewildered, the Mayavadi philosophers ascribe this bewilderment to the Supreme Lord, but that is not applicable. The Lord is never bewildered. That is the difference between personalists and impersonalists. Devahuti is not unintelligent. She has enough intelligence to understand that the living entities are not on the same level of the Supreme Lord. Because the living entities are infinitesimal, they become bewildered or conditioned by material nature. But this does not mean that the Supreme Lord is also conditioned or bewildered. The difference between the conditioned soul and the Lord is that the Lord is the Lord, the master of material nature, and he is therefore not subject to its control. He is controlled neither by spiritual nature nor by material nature. He is the supreme controller himself. And he cannot be compared to the ordinary living entities who are controlled by the laws of material nature. Two words used in this verse are sat and asat. The cosmic manifestation is asat, it does not exist. But the material energy of the Supreme Lord is sat, or ever existing. Material nature is ever existing in its subtle form as the energy of the Lord, but it sometimes manifests this non-existent or temporarily existent nature, the cosmos. An analogy may be made with the father and mother. The mother and the father exist, but sometimes the mother begets children. Similarly, this cosmic manifestation, which comes from the unmanifest material nature of the Supreme Lord, sometimes appears and again disappears. But the material nature is ever existing, and the Lord is the supreme cause for both the subtle and gross manifestations of this material world. Text 10. The Supreme Personality of Godhead said, "The unmanifested eternal combination of the three modes is the cause of the manifest state and is called pradhan. It is called prakriti when in the manifested stage of existence." Purport. The Lord points out material nature in its subtle stage, which is called pradhan, and he analyzes this pradhan. The explanation of pradhana and prakriti is that pradhana is the subtle, undifferentiated sum total of all material elements. Although they are undifferentiated, one can understand that the total material elements are contained therein. When the total material elements are manifested by the interaction of the three modes of material nature, the manifestation is called prakriti. Impersonalists say that Brahman is without variegatedness and without differentiation. One may say that pradhana is the Brahman stage, but actually the Brahman stage is not pradhan. Pradhan is distinct from Brahman because in Brahman there is no existence of the modes of material nature. One may argue that the Mahatattva is also different from pradhan because in the Mahatattva there are manifestations. The actual explanation of pradhana, however, is given here. When the cause and effect are not clearly manifested, avyakta, the reaction of the total elements does not take place. And that stage of material nature is called pradhana. Pradhana is not the time element, because in the time element there are actions and reactions, creation and annihilation. Nor is it the jiva, or material potency of living entities, or designated conditioned living entities. Nor is it the jiva, or marginal potency of living entities, or designated conditioned living entities, because the designations of the living entities are not eternal. One adjective used in this connection is nitya, which indicates eternality. Therefore, the condition of material nature immediately previous to its manifestation is called pradhana. Sounds pretty peaceful. Really nothing going on. Yeah? No time. No inclination of the jiva.
So, this is this when Srila Prabhupada talks about the Lord's external energy as an eternal reality, is always existing as Krishna's external energy. That would be like pradhana, like when he uses the analogy of father and mother sometimes have children, so that having children is like the material cosmos, prakriti manifest as the three modes of nature.
Right.
But in the unmanifest form, that's pradhana. That's the mother in functioning as the external energy, not necessarily active.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because once there's impregnation, which happens from the glance of Mahavishnu. What's the verse? Brahma Samhita number 7.
Maya Ramamanasya
Ramamana Naviyogasthaya Saha Atmana Ramaya Reme Tyaktakam Shashikshaya. So there's a way in which then, when he glances, does Mahavishnu, then that glance is sent as personified. It's actually Atmana Ramaya Reme Tyaktakam Shashikshaya. What's the next verse? Devi, so Rama Devi becomes the messenger of that glance, and so he's not implicated in connection with the material nature, but he just glances that way, and then the union of the manifestation of his internal potency becomes manifest in the material world, Shambhu and his consort, who then manifest the forms and the facilities for the perverted desires of the material, of the living entities of the material world. So before that, before the glance, it's neutral, then it becomes meaning pradhan becomes energized, and you get time, karma, and it starts to coagulate. Yes. And the modes of nature, yes.
Given that Krishna's external energy is eternal, and that her function is in relationship to the embodiment of, and she's a regulatrix, as we hear in the Brahma Samhita, of the material world with the material embodied jivas. But that's not an eternal activity, that's a periodic activity. What is her relationship with Krishna, with the Shaktiman, with the source, when she's not performing that function? Or is there such a question, because we understand that she's non-different from the internal energy? What happens to this function of so-called Maya, external energy, when she's not needed?
Well, look at it from the other way. She's manifests when she is needed, so she's not there when she's not needed. And the vision of Vyasadeva, in the vision of Vyasadeva, he was able to see the conditioned living entities and also the manifestation of his external energy personified was overseeing the living entities. But when it's all wound back up again into Ma Vishnu, then ahameva sameva agre nanyat sarasat param paschadaham tede tascha yovashisheta sosmyaham. Before that was, before the manifestation, there was only I was there. So it's in its potential stage. We have one from Apar Gaurangi. From Divyanga. Thanks, Div.
Yeah, this virus I'm suffering is one of my pastimes, not.
What is that?
Yeah, this virus I'm suffering is one of my pastimes. Not.
The what is?
He's sick, he's doing pastime.
Oh yeah, right. Not. Mahendra Prabhu.
To his question, I also had a question from yesterday when Prabhupada mentioned that there are no demigods in Vaikuntha, but in 11th canto, Krishna, in the process of deity worship, says that Durga and Ganesh and others should be present while he is worshipped, facing him in certain positions. And the acharyas, Juba Goswami, comment that these are the ones who are in the spiritual world, Durga and Ganesh. So
the demigods in the material world are expansions of those entities in the material world. Hence, the spiritual world, hence demigod. And for the pastimes in the spiritual world, there are those entities who are personalities who help in the pastimes and help with various parts of the Leela. That's indicated in Uvacha Puratas Tasmai Tasya Divya Saraswati Kama Krishna Govinda He Gopi Jani Tapi, verse where Divya Saraswati is indicated. He said, not the other Saraswati of the material world, he says in the purport, but Divya Saraswati from the spiritual world, not Brahma's wife, but Divya Saraswati is an expansion from Lakshmi.
So could that be the answer also to his question? In a sense, when manifested, what's that energy?
Yeah. Because everything unfolds from Krishna and Radha. Okay. If somebody had their hand up outside, I can roll the tape, or you can put it up again.
I actually gave a class in Los Angeles on this verse 9 where I came here.
Oh.
And Prabhupada has a lecture on practically every one of these verses from this chapter, because there was a time where he was just speaking on this day by day, I think in 1976 in Vrindavan. And this analogy which Srila Prabhupada gives here of a woman in connection with her husband as a wife and with children as a mother, when I read it initially, when I was preparing for this class, I kind of overlooked it. But when I went back and listened to the lecture, Prabhupada emphasized this a lot, that this is how Maya is relating with the living entities, and this is how Krishna is relating with the living entities. The living entity is subordinate to the mother and the father, whereas the mother has domination over the children, but subordination to the father. And so this is how Krishna is always in the position of the supreme controller, and how the living entity is always controlled. So, although this analogy is simple, it's extremely profound the way in which Srila Prabhupada expounded upon it. And it's just amazing how Srila Prabhupada is able to take these common examples and simplify such lofty topics. And that's what makes him the Shakshiya Vaishyavatar that he is that he's able to take these terms, present them, and then when you think about them a little bit, it makes it all very, very clear. So I'm just appreciating this particular analogy.
Thank you. Prabhupada Priya.
Hare Krishna. Yeah, I often think that when this topic comes up, that scientists are actually right about the Big Bang. They just don't know what causes it. What causes it is when the glance of Mahavishnu comes in contact with the Pradhan, and then things start sizzling. Things start manifesting and differentiating, and Mahatattva divides and subdivides into different forms and all the elements. And yeah, so it actually is kind of like that it looks like, because Pradhan is totally unmanifest, it looks like there's nothing. So there's nothing, apparently, and then all of a sudden there's something. And then from that something, everything comes out. All the elements and all the whole universe.
One of our devotees in our youth group gave a talk on the Big Bang recently. It was well received. He used Sariputta Prabhu's notes and lectures on it, and he just gave a history of how the theory evolved. That was sufficient for devotees to draw their own conclusions about its efficacy, because the connections that people made and the way they made them seemed, after he gives this presentation, they seem quite flimsy, the conclusion that they come to. That's not refuting the point you're making. I'm just saying that the idea of the Big Bang in general is highly speculative, at least the ways that the theory about it have come about and the reasons for why they think there was a Big Bang and so forth.
Who gave that presentation? Does he have notes?
Oh yeah, he's got a whole PowerPoint. It's online. We got our own BI. With kids, they've organized themselves and they're giving what are more consumable aspects of scientific and philosophical points.
What's it called online? Can I find it somewhere?
No, we just have a WhatsApp group right now. And you mean his presentation?
Yeah.
I can ask him. I'll ask him to send a link and you can look at it.
That type of material, the more it's public.
Ask Brajaras Bhavana to send the link for his presentation he gave at ISV. Pardon me?
The more that type of material is made public,
The more that you use the mic, otherwise I'll have to repeat.
I've just noticed that the more we can create databases where these types of presentations are just like ready-made for anyone to draw from and use, is extremely helpful for those who are teaching Krishna consciousness in various places.
Allah, Romapad Swami. He's got the most organized stuff in the world. Okay, we're 5 minutes away from our next break, and we're at text number, where?
11.
We're approaching text 11, is that right? I would like to read that, and then we'll read a few verses and we'll take our break. The aggregate elements, namely the 5 gross elements, the 5 subtle elements, the 4 internal senses, the 5 senses for gathering knowledge, and the 5 outward organs of action are known as pradhana. According to Bhagavad Gita, the sum total of the 24 elements described herein is called the Yonir Mahad Brahma. The sum total of the living entities is impregnated into this Yonir Mahad Brahma, and they are born in different forms, beginning from Brahma down to the insignificant ant. In the Srimad Bhagavatam and other Vedic literatures, the sum total of the 24 elements pradhana is also described as Yonir Mahad Brahma. It is the source of the birth and subsistence of all living entities. There are 5 gross elements, namely earth, water, fire, air, and ether. There are also 5 subtle elements, smell, taste, color, touch, and sound. The senses for acquiring knowledge and the organs for action number 10, namely the auditory sense, the sense of taste, the tactile sense, the sense of sight, the sense of smell, the active organ for speaking, the active organs for working, and those for traveling, generating, and evacuating. The internal subtle senses are experienced as having 4 aspects, in the shape of mind, intelligence, ego, and contaminated consciousness. Distinctions between them can be made only by different functions, since they represent different characteristics. Purport: the four internal senses or subtle senses described herein are defined by different characteristics. When pure consciousness is polluted by material contamination, and when identification with the body becomes prominent, one is said to be situated under false ego. Consciousness is the function of the soul, and therefore behind consciousness there is soul. Consciousness polluted by material contamination is called ahankar. All these are considered the qualified Brahman. The mixing element, which is known as time, is counted as the 25th element. According to the Vedic version, there is no existence beyond Brahman. Sarvam Kalavidam Brahma, from the Chandogya Upanishad. From where? It is stated also in the Vishnu Purana that whatever we see is Parasya Brahmana Shakti. Everything is an expansion of the energy of the Supreme Absolute Truth, Brahman. When Brahman is mixed with the three qualities, goodness, passion, and ignorance, there results the material expansion. I'll read that again since I missed the cadence. When Brahman is mixed with the three qualities, goodness, passion, and ignorance, there results the material expansion, which is sometimes called Saguna Brahman, and which consists of these 25 elements. In the Nirguna Brahman, where there is no material contamination, or in the spiritual world, the three modes, goodness, passion, and ignorance, are not present. Where Nirguna Brahman is found, simple unalloyed goodness prevails. Saguna Brahman is described by the Sankhya system of philosophy as consisting of 25 elements, including the time factor, past, present, and future. The influence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is felt in the time factor, which causes fear of death due to the false ego of the deluded soul who has contacted material nature. The living entity's fear of death is due to his false ego of identifying with the body. Everyone is afraid of death. Actually, there is no death for the spirit soul, but due to our absorption in the identification of the body as self, the fear of death develops. It is also stated in the Srimad Bhagavatam 11.2.37, Payam Dvitiya Binibeshita Syat. Dvitiya refers to matter, which is beyond spirit. Matter is the secondary manifestation of spirit, for matter is produced from spirit. Just as the material elements described are caused by the Supreme Lord or the Supreme Spirit, the body is also a product of the spirit soul. Therefore, the material body is called Dvitiya, or the second. One who is absorbed in this second element or second exhibition of the spirit is afraid of death. When one is fully convinced that he is not his body, there is no question of fearing death, since the spirit soul does not die. If the spirit soul engages in the spiritual activities of devotional service, he is completely freed from the platform of birth and death. His next position is complete spiritual freedom from a material body. The fear of death is the action of the kala, or the time factor, which represents the influence of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. In other words, time is destructive. Whatever is created is subject to destruction and dissolution, which is the action of time. Time is a representation of the Lord, and it reminds us also that we must surrender unto the Lord. The Lord speaks to every conditioned soul as time. He says in Bhagavad Gita that if someone surrenders unto him, then there is no longer any problem with birth and death. We should therefore accept the time factor as the Supreme Personality of Godhead standing before us. This is further explained in the following verse. Dear Srila Prabhupada, dear Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, Shri Panchatattva Jai Shri Teen Thakur. if you so desire, please let us develop a humble service attitude to the Supreme Personality of Godhead and work cooperatively with Him in all ways. Thank you for considering our request. Om Tat Sat. Everyone agrees with this prayer in whole or in part. Please unmute and say Hare Krishna. Gaur Premanande. Nitai Gaura Hari Bo. Hari Bo. Hari Bo. Nitai Gaura Hari Bo. Nitai Gaura Hari Bo. Hari Bo. Hari Bo. Nitai Gaura Hari Bo. Panchukalpadrishcha Kripasindabheva Chapatitanam Pavanibhyo Vaishnavebhyo. And we'd like to thank the Govardhan a cappella choir once again. Hare Krishna. We're coming back here at 4 o'clock for our next session, which will be between 4 and 6:30. Doesn't get any better than this. See you soon. And you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here.